Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Tech Talk. Fix your ledger before it breaks your payments. My name is Matt McNerney. I lead our ledgers and recon engineering teams, and I'm going to host today. Also with me on the call is Koji Marase. He is the ledger's product lead, and then Matt Higgins is the leader of our engineering architecture group. Before we dive into the content, a couple of quick housekeeping items. So first, this conversation will be recorded today, and we'll share it with all of the attendees afterwards. So if you missed something, don't worry about it. And then also, this is meant to be an interactive session. That's why we're doing it live. So if you have a question, make use of the question box on your screens. And we'd love to spend a lot of the time here just answering live questions. And if we can't get to it today, don't worry, we will respond to it maybe just afterwards. We'll catch you via email. Cool. Okay, so before we dive into our technical content today, we wanted to do a quick icebreaker and share our food hot takes. Strangely enough, this is a modern treasury tradition. We have a lot of controversial takes on food, like, is a hot dog a sandwich or a taco, that kind of thing. I'll get started with mine. My hot take is that fruitcake is delicious. And maybe the best part about it is that I always get to eat the whole thing whenever we have it. I'll pass it to Koji.
That is a bad take. All right, my food hot take is that dry pasta is, in most cases, way superior to fresh pasta. I think fresh pasta is romanticized because it's harder for people to make. But dry pasta has a better texture.
You cook it, right?
Yeah, obviously. Yeah, not like you take it out of the box. I've known people do that, but
yeah, I thought you were just eating spaghetti like out of the box.
Oh no! Well, yeah, let me just clarify that. Still boil it, please.
Al dente, though. My food hot take is that milk is for babies, and adults who continue to drink milk should really review the end-to-end process that's happening there, and maybe rethink what they're doing.
Okay. I think the science backs you up on that one. So moderately hot, I will say. Cool. Okay, now that we've gotten that out of the way, let's talk about ledgers and payments. So I wanted to start us off broad. Ledger, that word has been around for forever. People have been using ledgers in various contexts, using various technologies from pen and paper all the way to, mainframe servers to today's cloud. But I feel like, from my perspective, I'm hearing a lot more about this concept of application ledger over the past 10 years or so. And I want to be precise about what exactly we're talking about. So let me pass this out to the room. What is a ledger, specifically the kind that we're going to talk about today? Maybe Koji, you want to start?
Yeah, I can take this. Ledger, very high level, it's a financial database. So I know a lot of the folks that are joining the call, you might be engineers that are building fintech products, systems. Ledger is just the database underneath that tracks money. And like McNerney said, there's a long history to accounting in general. I think we won't do a full history lesson, but I think double entry accounting started in Renaissance Italy. Basically, the merchants in Florence and Venice were establishing the first, what we would think of as modern banking systems. They had debts, they had assets, and double entry is a way to cleanly track those and not lose track of money that's going to come in or go out. And obviously, we're hundreds of years since then, but the modern software ledger, if you're an engineer, you need to understand that history because there's hundreds of years of prior art in how money is tracked. And we're not throwing that out the window just because software has advanced. I think if anything, because fintech has reached such a mature stage, we're seeing more engineers, product managers become aware of the fact that there are these kind of best practices that have to be built into their system. And we're also seeing, as fintech matures, there are real public case studies out there of companies that haven't built a ledger and what goes wrong with that, or have built the ledger the wrong way. So I think ultimately the ledger, obviously it's the financial database, but it's also the bridge between the world of finance and accounting and the world of software engineering. And because those worlds are colliding more and more with modern fintech companies, we're seeing it become a topic.
And ledgers isn't the only thing with a long history that moved into software where the requirements have been the same. Like with messaging, we had carrier pigeons and couriers. Then we started running our own email servers, and then we ended up with Gmail. We had wax seals for identity, and now we have Okta. In marketplaces, there were town squares, and now we have Shopify. And at first, these systems that have had no changes in the requirements just moved from like the physical to digital world, and it was just like the same thing, but it was digital. And then there were these web services that came out that enabled new use cases that went beyond what you originally could do. Let's just take like Gmail messaging. You can search your emails now. You couldn't search before. And so that's a really important thing to realize, is that when you move from the physical to digital, that's just one step. And then the next step is to get a lot more around that original, very easy to understand premise.
Cool. Yeah, I think what I'm noticing is that there's broad acceptance now of this idea that in order to track money in an application, you need to do more than just track, how much money is there. Generally, every engineer will say, hey, we need to have some kind of immutable log. We need to be able to roll back history. And that concept of an immutable log is one foundational element of a ledger. That's not controversial. Maybe I'll pose a question to you, Higgins. As an engineering leader, how do you think about architecting this ledger? And the perspective I'm thinking of is, hey, I could probably implement a ledger myself in a Ruby script in about 30 minutes. But what differentiates that from what fintechs need today, and how would you think about a build versus buy decision?
Well, what's funny is there's a 2005 blog post from Martin Fowler, who was kind of a well-known software engineer, who used building a ledger as his example application for how to build an enterprise application. And it's maybe like 100 lines of code. So it kind of reinforces, well, you can build it. Going back to let's say Okta, you could build your own authentication system too. The issue is that you just end up with the database with a table of just the core main feature, but you have no, let's say, user interface. Let's say you're building your own authentication server. Now you want to delete users. Okay, now you have to add a UI, or the developer has to manually delete each user. And so there's a lot of features around the 100-line first week thing you have to make that you just end up building more and more of, where a full-time developer is working on it. There's also I can think of a lot of real-world complexities around beyond the idealistic, just original ledger, where these oddities might, make it more challenging to make that you haven't thought about.
Yeah, we're big Martin Fowler fans here. And I think the reason even we decided a ledger product made sense was because we were seeing so many people read that Fowler article. There are a few other kind of thinkers out there and kind of rebuild the same system over and over again and run into the same issues. So yeah, your time is limited as an engineer, or if you're running an engineering group, and you don't really want to reinvent the wheel if it's been solved well in the past.
An example would be reporting. Let's say you wanted to know the state of your ledger 2 months ago. You wouldn't get that with the Martin Fowler article. You have to now, if you have a user interface, and you also have to have snapshotting tables. And these are things that Modern Treasury has built because every customer has asked for these features. And these are the kind of things that your company would ask your engineering team to add to that original thing, right?
Totally. Yeah, I'd love to dive into some of the issues that we've come across. I think one of the coolest parts about my role over the past couple of years here is getting to talk to so many fintechs that either have built their own ledger or they're designing it for the first time and talking with us about common pitfalls. Let me rattle off a couple that I remember, and feel free, Koji and Higgins, to jump in. The first one is what we've called the hot account problem, and I've actually seen this mentioned a ton of times online now. And this actually came up first in my previous job when I worked at Square. There's a fundamental issue in double entry accounting where one entry, usually the credit entry, is representing a user, and how many times a day does a user transact? Maybe 5 to 10 times. You're not running into any scalability issues there. The other entry is usually a debit, and it represents some settlement account. It represents an asset, and that is usually present on every single transaction across your whole program. That could be, thousands of entries per second. That is not something that typically you can do one by one. And if you do, you are subject to increasing latency. Like the more traffic on your database, the more your product grows, the more latency they're going to start to experience. And that's a real problem when you're talking about digital wallet or card authorizations. So that was the first thing we came across. We have a lot of blog posts out there on how we ended up solving it, and there's some cool information out there on the internet. Everyone hits this problem, and it's not actually as high of a throughput as you would expect.
Yeah, just to interject, the reason those are two competing priorities is because both of those entries have to atomically happen, right? So like there are a lot of versions of this. Let's say it's like card issuance, you're doing card authorizations, you're powering this underlying debit card. A user is spending their money, you also expect that money to come in from your card settlement partner. You can't have one of those legs happen if the other leg doesn't happen. So they need to happen, both kind of succeed or fail in the same action, and yet you need one of these to be happening at really high speed and throughput and the other not.
Totally.
So to give an example of how this idealistic thing that seems really clean starts to break is we've broken some of the 400 years ago Venice rules, right, with how we might manage this. We have some cases where we might asynchronously update the debit side, right?
Right. And
there's kind of a distinction between doing it synchronously versus doing it atomically, I guess, or doing it as a single success failure case.
Right. Other examples we've come across, one is on payouts. This is a really common pattern across payroll companies and also marketplace companies. The idea that you owe one of your customers some money, and it references a bunch of transactions that they've done over a time period. You need to make sure that every transaction is paid out. And there was a famous bug at a company that we've worked with where they had two microservices, one for processing payments and then one for settling. If a payment happened right at the settlement cutoff, such that it was present in the payment system but not in the settlement system, that payment would never get paid out. And you were talking about like low dollar amounts, so your monitoring would never catch this, but your customers will catch it and say, hey, why is this number not adding up? So it means that you need something more than just a date cutoff. You need some concept of a payout that knows which transactions have been paid on and which ones haven't. And that's a problem that we've dug a lot into as well. And then one other one that comes up for us a lot is, and I hear this from people in the fintech space a lot, that the ledger itself isn't even the full scope of the problem. It's making sure that the ledger is actually accurately reflecting what's happening in the real world. Because sure, you can say, hey, I paid this out on the ledger, but then there's the messy real world of payments that happens after that. What if it gets reversed? What if there's insufficient funds? What if one of thousands of errors occur? Um, and we talked to a leading fintech a couple of years ago, and they mentioned, hey, at the end of the month, frequently we would be $1 million that we couldn't track down, and it was always a fire for about a week to track down, okay, why is our operational bank account $1 million off from our ledger? It's because there was no architectural guarantees that the balances would match up, and it's not something they're looking at every day. They're only looking at it when they're closing their books.
Modern Treasury has, integrated the payment system with our ledger. If you can use our ledger system by itself, but we also have the payment side, so we know all those intricacies that can happen. Just a really easy example is just a reversal where you send the payment, you mark it, and now you have to handle reversals and returns and other things that can happen later. And so a lot can go wrong with figuring out where your money is in these systems that aren't synchronously, all updating everything at the same time.
Yeah, and I mentioned the ledger is the collision of the finance accounting world, where every dollar matters, with the software world, where things are happening at really high transaction volumes. But it's also the collision of the clean, abstract, perfect software world and the real world of money movements. And you might have a really nice model for how your ledger should work, but then you have a processing partner or a payment system that has to deal with corner cases, manual exceptions, that kind of thing. And so I think a lot of the hard-earned lessons we've learned over time, and that fintechs learn over time when they build their own systems, is how do you actually prepare for all of those weird corner cases and make sure they get reflected in your kind of perfect ledgering world. One other kind of pitfall that you didn't mention, McNearney, that I see a lot is building the ledger to the wrong level of abstraction. So many of the fintechs that we work with, the really innovative companies, you might be building a digital wallet, like a checking system, but the vision is that interacts with your marketplace or a factoring or loan system. You have a single shared balance that can be used as a checking account or, on the marketplace side or for rewards points. And you might build a ledger for that first use case, but it's not extensible to the second use cases because they all have different kind of underlying needs. And so the biggest risk we often see when folks start thinking about their ledger is just, how do I use the right primitives? It's a really abstract question, but how do I use the right primitives to be flexible enough to extend to all of these different use cases and power all the things that our business wants to do? And that's something that we have a ton of experience with. I mean, even if you're thinking about building your own ledger, we find that it's helpful to talk with you and just be like, hey, have you thought about these pieces? It's something we're always happy to weigh in on and brainstorm about, because this is really the thing that holds companies back as they scale.
Totally. I want to answer a question that just came in from Satnam. Why isn't reconciliation done in real time across the industry? I have the same question, Koji and Higgins. What are your perspectives?
Well, the confirmation from the bank is asynchronous when you deal with like legacy, most large banks who are doing like wires and ACH. You drop a file somewhere, they pick it up, they send the data over, and then 2 days later at 5 p.m., they provide us a transactions file that we have to use in our payment system. We have an entire reconciliation system that matches up this really dirty data set of transactions back to the payments. And so that type of reconciliation is like not possible to just assume that it's immediate. Now with like stablecoin, for example, we immediately get a response and there actually is no reconciliation process at all that needs to happen.
Yeah, I think the short answer is inertia, right? Like the industry is so used to these batch-based, maybe daily systems. Obviously, finance organizations are used to daily and monthly closes, and that's kind of their set of requirements. But if you're operating a modern fintech product, you usually do need to show real-time balances. You need to show your partners real-time settlement information. And so, yeah, going off of those old patterns doesn't really work. We find that the partners that are really moving fast are the ones that are doing real-time reconciliation and real-time payments as well. Obviously, there are more and more systems that let you execute payments real time.
But to actually make it look like real time, let's say to the customer, you kind of have to upfront the money if your back end isn't actually doing it, right? So
yeah, that's great. If your underlying payment system is not real time, obviously there are kind of more real time payment systems. Like we partner with a lot of banks that offer RTP, FedNow. Higgins, you mentioned stablecoin. Those are more real-time systems, but if the underlying rails are ACH, something that's less real-time, yeah, we see a lot of business models where you have to front the funds and make it look like the money is moving in real-time. And those are cases where having a proper double entry ledger is exponentially more important because you're putting financial risk on the line. Not only are you holding user funds that you have to keep track of, but there's money out there that really belongs to you that you have to keep track of. And that's often when they start adopting those kinds of business models are often cases where companies need to rethink, is my ledger really safe or does it expose me to risk?
Well, only one other thing I would add is that real-time reconciliation in homegrown systems is at odds with speed and growth of your company. It's not something that you're going to focus on when you're building your first version of your product. You're focused on growing. So you solve the problem at the end of the month with human resources to go and track down the funds. And that's where a lot of customers find value of outsourcing their ledger because those, it's already architecturally aligned with your payments system. You don't have to build it yourself, and it's optimized for real time for your apps, but also for Recon. Also, Sanam, thanks for the question. Please keep the questions coming. We want to make sure that this session is focused on what y'all are interested in. This talk is called Fix Your Ledger Before It Breaks Your Payments. I'm curious, Koji, you and I did this maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. What's different since we last talked? What would you say is what are the trends you're seeing maybe over the last 5 to 10 years around ledgering or fintech in general that's making this problem more important?
Yeah, I think one thing that's top of mind to me is just we've seen more ways that it can break, and we've seen really public kind of infamous cases where it's broken. Obviously, we've had some banking failures since then. We've had failures of banking as a service companies, just cases where we see what happens when you don't properly keep track of your funds. So I think it's just a lot more concrete today. And the companies we work with realize that you're basically exposing yourself to existential risk if you don't have a really robust system. That also translates, by the way, to the different financial partners in the ecosystem. We've seen banks have a really different attitude, for instance, towards partnering with fintech companies and looking for a lot more sustainable and safe way to guarantee that fintechs are ledgering things properly. And so one pattern that I think was a lot more innovative or provocative years ago, but that's a lot more accepted and standard now is the idea of exposing your ledger, having a standard way to expose your ledger to your bank. We have customers that'll sub-ledger user funds on our system and then give direct access to that ledger to their bank partner to show, hey, this is where the user funds are in this really standardized way. We actually also have an FDIC letter that you can look up online about this pattern that we recommend as best practice, this trusted infrastructure partner pattern. So that's one really big change that I've seen. I'm curious. I don't know. you guys if you've seen other kind of changes in the past few years.
I think something Higgins and I were talking about the other day is how much money movement is happening outside of banks now. Like if you're an Uber driver, one of your primary banks is the Uber app. Same with Shopify. Higgins, you have some experience there. You know, the primary banking actions of having a checking account, savings account, getting loans, that you might be doing that more with a fintech than with a bank these days. And that means that, you know, the banking cores maybe aren't doing the majority of ledgering anymore. It's fintechs.
Yeah, the actual companies, it's really abstract, but it's just like debt itself that comes out of nowhere. The software companies are fabricating another layer of money that is moving around that's even more abstract, where the like with Shopify, when you sign up, you get a balance account where you get immediately as a business owner like $100 or something like that. Where there's this new software layer that sits in front of the bank, and the bank is becoming less the source of truth. Obviously, there's a lot of risk. There's a lot of risk to these things because now the software companies, I think ultimately will have to have the same compliance as the bank because they're taking on the same level of risk, because you can call it fintech, whatever you want, but when you give someone money, it's a loan and there's risk. But at minimum, they have to have all these systems in place like ledgers to make sure that they don't, lose money.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, in-network payments have really been growing. I mean, I think this is another change to the fintech ecosystem we've seen, and it makes sense. I wouldn't say to everyone who's joined this talk who works at a startup, hey, you should go implement in-network payments, because it really only makes sense once you've hit scale as a fintech. If you have millions of users that are using your app, it makes sense to let them have payments directly to each other in your own ecosystem, often because you have a lot more control. Obviously, it's kind of the fastest and cheapest way to make payments happen. And you kind of, like you implied, you kind of become a bank in a certain way. You get to control the flow of money. Another variant of that we see is rewards points. One of our companies that we work with is Built Rewards, and we've been seeing them do really interesting things where they're expanding beyond their initial rent payment value proposition to being the service provider for any kind of neighborhood transaction. And that means that if you go out into your neighborhood and you eat at a restaurant, or you go to a different kind of service provider or gym, you can start interacting within the Built ecosystem and using Built points. It's something that makes sense once you have scale. I also love the anecdote that I'm sure a lot of you all are aware of, but about how airlines, if you look at airlines valuation, I don't know if they've looked at this in the past couple of years, but historically, if you look at the valuation of major airlines, a lot of the time their rewards points programs are worth more than the value of the overall airline operating group itself. Like, operating the planes loses the airline money, but having a rewards and credit card program is what makes them all of their money. And it's because they're able to basically dictate the rules of engagement when they control all these in-network transactions.
I love the reward points examples because it gets at how ledgering and reconciliation are sometimes the same problem. Like if you think about how you would implement something like Built rewards points without a robust application ledger, you would have one ledger that keeps track of the points, and then another settlement system that's figuring out how much you owe the businesses to pay them in cash. The cool thing about a robust application ledger is you don't even need that recon system if you can atomically, make transactions between business units, like the one that's settling out to restaurants. Same for airline rewards. You wouldn't need that recon process if you could atomically convert money to points and then also, add to the settlement account for the restaurant at the end of the day.
So like what kind of happens is the company originally builds on top of a bank and thinks about payments, but then their central core, as they build like something like shop cash or a reward system is that the ledger becomes the core of how everything is operating around versus the bank. Basically, the source of truth kind of moves to their own internal ledger from the bank, right?
Totally.
The bank is still incredibly important in that scenario because the cash is all sitting with them. And the bank can't be totally distant from understanding what do these subledgers look like. That kind of relates to what I mentioned earlier. But yeah, the actual control over where the money is going passes more to the fintech itself.
Right, but like let's say you have a user interface and it shows you how much money this user has available, it's coming from your own ledger table, and not from the bank account that maybe you originally built on.
Yeah, exactly. And as a fintech, that gives you so much more control. In a payroll use case, you don't have to wait for the money to move before you show it to the employer or employee. In a trading system, probably when someone signs up and loads funds into their trading account, you want them to be able to trade that right away and see it in their account. That's going to plug into your activation metrics.
So what happens like with the traditional payroll system versus the new ones? What do you think they're doing differently?
I mean, old systems, you just have to wait. You're totally dependent on the underlying rails, and you say, hey, like we think you're going to see your balance update here in a few days. Come check back. But obviously, the standard payroll is a really competitive space right now, and we're seeing the standard change there in terms of what companies and employees will accept.
Basically, they're able to pay the money. Like, I see a question like international. Like, they're able to like pay someone a day sooner before the actual movement of the money even happens in the bank.
Exactly.
Yeah, relevant question from Mohan. We're talking about airline points and dollar conversion. The question is to build an international money transfer system. How would you model flow of money through accounts in a third-party ledger, especially if there's a currency exchange? And how do you reconcile in the ledger when money is a different settlement currency? Great question. Comes up a lot with our customers. Maybe I'll pass it to Koji.
Yeah, we see a lot of different examples of this. I think it's especially pertinent right now. I think cross-border money movements are a growing space right now, and cross-currency wallets. Generally, it's the same with more variables. I mean, the problem is the same, but you have to think about more currencies, which is you're still going to need to do double entry ledgering, but now instead of, let's say, 2 entries in one currency, you have 4 entries in 2 currencies. And you have to abide by those same rules of you're not creating or destroying money. The other perspective that we've seen the best fintechs do is if you're doing that cross-currency transaction with, let's say, 4 entries, those 4 entries now have to be atomic. So now you have essentially a transaction in 2 different currencies impacting 4 different accounts at least, but it has to happen atomically. And we go back to the problem that McNerney mentioned earlier of you might have hot accounts involved. You might have some entries here needing to be processed at a different speed than other ones. And so you have to think about how do you architect this to make sure that it happens as one transaction, but across multiple currencies. So we have a perspective on how this is done, and our solutions team, which works with our customers and helps them through it, has seen a lot of different patterns here, but that's kind of the baseline that we recommend. When it comes to the actual settlement, like exchange rate and currency, there are going to be a lot more legs and moving pieces there. Some companies will have often an FX partner or a settlement partner that they then have to coordinate against. And there it's a similar coordination problem to if you're executing a payment through the bank, where you might need to have kind of a notion of a pending transaction that's going to occur that gets reflected back into the ledger when the settlement partner tells you what actually happened.
When does the currency rate apply? Maybe not just an MT, but recommended. When does the currency rate get applied? When is it when the ledger entry is put in, or when the bank does the action? do you need to know the real-time currency in hindsight to make the computation when it actually happens?
The answer is it depends. It depends on the implementation. Often what FX partners will do is give you an initial quote, and then when the settlement actually happens, they'll tell you the final rate. And so you need to have this notion of a pending kind of a mutable transaction, mutable in the sense that you can update the entries, not in the sense that you don't have a history of how the entries were updated, that then gets updated when the settlement partner tells you the final rate. But it really depends. We've seen so many versions of that.
Yeah, I wish we had a whiteboard. There's a way to do it with 4 entries, 2 per each currency, where you can do an atomic conversion of currencies in one transaction. So you can, like, if you have euros, you can still pay out in USD, but do it atomically. And also, I like this question because this is one of the things that we got wrong with the first version of our ledger. If you read an accounting textbook, it'll tell you you should have one ledger for each currency and they don't communicate with each other. And then our customers came to us with this exact problem of like, okay, fine, I have all these different ledgers now, but I can't atomically operate between them. So we made that change. Now you can do multiple currencies on the same transaction in the same ledger. Just one good example of all the things we've learned over the past couple of years.
There's a question from Mohammed here that I like, which is, what's the difference between the ledger we use in banks and digital wallets versus the blockchain? So I thought maybe the blockchain would come up. So to be clear, the ledger we're talking about here is not crypto, the blockchain ledger. It's kind of the core fintech ledger, the database system. That said, there's relationships with when we use the word ledger in the blockchain. Some of our customers do use this core fintech database to track crypto balances. But I think the big difference is the blockchain is a type of ledger, a very specific type of ledger developed for a very specific purpose, which is a distributed ledger. Everyone has their own copy of the ledger, and there's a lot of kind of, to hand wave away and simplify a complex system, a kind of rules of engagement and set of systems to ensure that all of those stay in sync. That's not a problem that you have to solve for if you're a fintech where you're the source of truth and you can control everything. And actually the blockchain, because it's designed for that purpose, has a lot of problems with it, has a lot of use cases it doesn't work for. I think one of the funny things we see is we do have customers that are in the crypto space, and it turns out crypto, even though it involves ledgers, a lot of the time they don't use that blockchain ledger for a lot of their money movement. They don't use it for everything. Often if you have a product that let's say you have a consumer crypto product that lets your users hold crypto, you might just have that in one omnibus, one big pile of crypto on the blockchain, and then you're sub-ledgering behind that in your own system. Why would you do that? Because putting updates directly onto the blockchain is expensive, it takes time. Similar to doing things on banking rails, it's just slower than controlling everything yourself. And so I think that's kind of funny that we talk about, I think a lot of folks associate the word ledger with crypto and blockchain, but actually if you look at a lot of these companies that are doing innovative things, they're still relying on this very kind of vanilla financial database notion of a ledger, and the blockchain is not really appropriate for those kinds of use cases.
Do you think that a ledger like we're talking about today will still be relevant as the world moves more towards stablecoins, as it seems like it's going in that direction?
Might be a matter of opinion, but I think so. I think stablecoins is another example of something that's good at certain things, certainly innovating a lot in cross-border payments and those kinds of spaces, but there are very few people that are saying that the entire banking system that we know as we know it is going to go away, or that fintech companies with all of the innovations they have brought are going to go away entirely or move entirely to a stablecoins world. So, every one of these innovations has its place in the world.
Even if the whole world was 100% stablecoin, all of the things we've talked about, the use cases and the needs would still apply. For example, fronting someone money with a rewards account, or the reporting. don't change even if it's on stablecoin, and reconciliation kind of goes away and everything's in real time.
Right. Yeah. Something we've heard from customers is that a crypto ledger is great for distributed trust, but it's terrible for latency. And we've had some customers migrate from QLDB, which got sunset for exactly that reason. When you're doing cryptographic hashing, you can only do one thing at a time. There's no opportunity for batching or high throughput, low latency. So yeah, I agree with you, Matt. Even if we were 100% a stablecoin world, that would probably just increase the need for application ledgers that are enabling the real-time aspect. How do you think about scalability in a ledger? Maybe I'll pass it to the engineering leader in the room. Higgins, when we say scalable ledger, what exactly does that mean?
Well, if you go back to like just the core ledger that just has one table, there's kind of like this kind of hello world database transaction you need to do that, in a couple of days you could set up a test and get a throughput rate and write it the most optimal way and find out your writes per second, especially with like to figure out like your hot account speed. Where a lot of scalability issues come up is actually the features that you build around the ledger, let's say like reporting or search. So we offer the ability to search your ledger and look for transactions in it. So as transactions occur against a ledger, we are in real time adding the records to our search index, and they're available within the same second, a second later, through an API request or the UI. So we're solving those problems with like a centralized. It's one of the benefits of just any web service is like you have to solve. If you have to solve these problems, you don't want to pay for it all in house if it's been solved. If we've solved it like for hundreds of customers, and so the cost of adding those extra features around the main thing is actually where most of the scalability issues come up. The other one would be the reporting features where we know what the ledger was at 2 or 3 weeks ago, require updating, let's say, denormalized tables that have redundant information, and making sure that those are accurate and not outdated are just another example of like keeping those up to date in a high scale environment.
There are a couple more questions that came in here.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get to them. One, Daniel, I saw you asked, have we come up across any use cases for non-money movement tracking? Yeah, I want to be clear about what this kind of thinking is useful for. Certainly, use cases that don't involve the flow of value or finances in general, you shouldn't use a double entry ledger for. If you're tracking user clicks, sure, certain notions of immutability might be useful, but we wouldn't recommend you use our ledger to track user clicks as a currency. That said, a double entry ledger is useful for actions that might not correspond entirely to an explicit movement of money. An example of that would be the kind of explicit movement of money example is I'm subledgering an omnibus bank account. So I have a bank partner, I have a big pile of money there, and when users send in money, I make sure that it's attributed to that user and also them tracking the overall bank account balance. The kind of non-explicit money movement example is loans. With loans or with liabilities or with a marketplace where buyers and sellers might be interacting. A purchase might occur on your system. No money might move at t equals 0, but you need to record that there's a liability, that the buyer has to send in money and the seller has to be sent money. And you do want a proper double entry ledger for that, even though money isn't moving yet. So there are those kinds of examples where you wouldn't do it on kind of like a banking core or on a asset tracking system, but you would do it on a double entry ledger.
I think the other aspect of Daniel's question is the difference between recording and authorizing. We've been talking a lot about the ledger responding to real-time card auth, and Daniel's saying, can you use the ledger database just for analytics too? So the transactions have happened somewhere else and we're just recording them. we definitely have seen use cases like that, and that's what kind of ties what Matt was talking about. The reporting side of this is quite difficult as well, especially if like there is no one database out there that can do both high throughput ingest and also robust reporting on top of it. You have to build your own custom architecture that is suited to the specific use case to make that work well. We definitely have some customers that are using us just for recording and reporting. Koji, I don't know if you want to add anything on that.
No, that's a great point to add on. I see a few more questions here. We're having a bunch of questions come in here. I think there's a question probably you'd have some thoughts on, McNerney, which is, in a high throughput append-only system, how have we approached maintaining a real-time, always correct balance without sacrificing performance or system integrity? And this is why it's a hard problem, I think. This is why we've spent years building out a ledger and building the right infrastructure, thinking about how do locks interact with account balances, cached balances, transactions. McNerney, I don't know if you have a succinct answer to that.
Yeah, the answer is that you can't have both, right? You cannot have high throughput and also a consistent, or like a read after write consistency. Because in order to have read after write consistency, you need to process things one at a time. And so this is where maybe the main thing I've learned over the past 4 years is from our coworkers on the payments side of what needs to be read after write consistent and what can be eventually consistent. So obviously authorizing transactions, whether it's on a digital wallet or a payout or card auth, that must be read after write consistent. You must do things one at a time. Otherwise, it's possible for competing auths to pull a balance below zero. If they're both read the balance and say, hey, we have enough, and they pull from it, you're going to end up overdrawing. And that's not an acceptable bug for user balances. But if you're just recording things that are happening, it's already out of date. The transaction has already been authorized on another system. All you're trying to do is record history. So there, what's more important is not read after write consistency, but every time you view the ledger, it should be consistent. So if you see a balance, you should be able to know exactly which entries contributed to that balance. And we have features around lock versions and ledger entries that are ordered by those lock versions and ledger accounts that have lock versions. You can see some of this in our API docs. The other aspect is effective add, and this is something we got from Martin Fowler. So when you write to a ledger, there's two timestamps. One is when the ledger found out about the transaction, and the other one is when that transaction actually took effect. We call it effective at. And so you can always order stuff by when the ledger knew about it and also when it should have actually been effective. That's useful for backfills, but also useful for that example I brought up before, where maybe your payment system is different from your settlement system, and you need the settlement system to know about the payments timestamps. So those are just two of the main ones, but this is something we have to think about every day, and it's just fundamentally difficult about double entry accounting at scale.
We skipped over a question from Jeff Howie about, I guess, migrating a ledger or the payment backend. First, modern Treasury just abstracts that because the backends of their payments is what we're abstracting. But just in general, with migrations, you want to kind of go into a shadow mode where you continue to run your current system, and then you can route some % of your requests to a new system. So let's say you want to use RTP, like Cross River Bank and Evolve have basically sandboxes so that you could just pretend like a certain account is using that. So you want to just plug that in to maybe 5% of your requests and have it in shadow mode so you're not actually moving money. And then once that's there, you have some date where you can then do a backfill and slowly, see if that works and see where the edge cases are with just migrating safe, in a very safe sandbox environment, a migration to like an RTP system, and you want to pick one that has like a shadow mode or sandbox available. We've obviously migrated customers from their ledger to our ledger too, and we have a bunch of docs we can share about how we recommend doing that. Some customers kind of might have downtime, but if that's not acceptable, we have real-time recommendations on how to do that. But you definitely don't want to just spend 9 months, making the new system and then just flipping every customer over. You need to have some things in place around. The other one you could do is maybe all new customers could go onto the new system, so that you just have like from one date on, every new customer goes onto the new system, and then you have another slow rollout technique so that those don't require migrations. But there is obviously some risk involved. But of course, the newer customers might have less money or less history.
I think Jeff's question also, if I understand, comes from kind of the bank perspective of updating a bank core, and bank cores are their own topic, which we don't have the time to get into as we're running out of time. But one thing I would say is, no matter how good your bank core is, fintechs are going to want to bring their own ledger. They're going to want to innovate on what they can do in terms of financial instruments and products that they're offering. And so one of the most important things, we work with a lot of banks that work with a lot of fintechs. One of the most important things to make that a successful relationship is often making sure that the fintech can bring their own ledger and that you're able to accommodate that. And I mentioned we have this pattern for how the fintech can expose their subledger to the bank, and the bank can make sure that abides by kind of the risk tolerances and hygiene that they require.
I want to get Arsenio's other question as well. It's related to exchange rates. So what if the exchange rate changes between the time the fintech writes this transaction and when it actually settles? What mechanisms are in place to ensure that the original transaction rate hasn't been tampered with or spoofed? Koji, have you worked with any of our customers on that issue?
Yeah, I think we have limited time, so I'll try to answer very quickly. I think two things. Number one, immutability. One of the cores to what we think goes into a proper ledger is immutable transactions, and that means you have a record of everything you put in. If you have this old rate, it goes in with that first holding transaction, and then it gets updated in the second. The second is they're kind of best practices in how you set aside the money, how you kind of lock it up so it doesn't get spent in that interim period. And that's something that, if you're curious about, we're happy to have our teams talk to you about.
Cool. And then, unfortunately, we're hitting towards the end of time. And don't worry, we will follow up on all these questions. But the last one that we have time for is one that I like, which is from Daniel. What are the best resources for learning about financial ledgers? Clearly, we love Martin Fowler, but what else?
Well, a funny one is a developer last week was using ChatGPT to ask questions about ledgers. They were a new employee, and ChatGPT actually quoted, without even trying to, quoted one of Modern Treasury's blog posts and linked him back to Modern Treasury. So we have some resources that ChatGPT has been trained on. We do show up on a lot of just Google search results for just simple questions.
There's not a lot out there, which is why we're going to keep putting out content, subscribe to our journal. We'll keep putting out journaling content. McNearney, who's on the call, has put out a very popular piece among fintechs called How to Scale a Ledger. We also have a piece that Lucas on our product team wrote called Accounting for Developers, which is a great starting point if you're kind of a newer fintech startup and you want your dev team to get up to speed on best practices. But yeah, it looks almost like a plug because we definitely recommend checking out the content on our website and staying subscribed.
What's there's the Substack that we like as well, Alvaro.
Alvaro, yes. He has a great Substack, the Payments Engineer Playbook, I think, that I'm subscribed to.
Yeah, we're fans of his writing as well. Cool. Okay. Thanks, everyone, for your time, for the awesome questions. Thanks, Koji and Higgins, for your insights today. Just a few quick things before we wrap up. Number one, we're going to be hosting an Accounting for Developers happy hour in San Francisco in September. So if you don't like reading all the blog posts we just told you about, just come talk with us. We'll have a presentation, some drinks, and you can ask more questions there. We'd love to see you there. We'd welcome anyone local to the Bay Area to join us, and you can register for that using the link pinned in the Q&A chat. Aside from that, thanks again for everyone's time today, and see you soon.
Other quick plug, if you're building a ledger, if you're dealing with ledgering problems, our team is always happy to chat and share our experiences and best practice. And our sandbox is open. So if you're curious to try out our product, go to our sandbox and start playing.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.